I survived the Great Alaska Earthquake, 1964. Chapter 1. Friday, March 27th, 1964. 5:36 p.m. Valdez, Alaska. To 11-year-old Jackson Barrett, it seemed like the world was ending. He was caught in the middle of the most powerful earthquake in United States history. Across Alaska, the ground shattered like glass. Buildings fell to pieces. Icy cliffsides crashed into the sea. Giant tsunami waves smashed into towns and villages along the coast. Just moments before it started, Jackson had been at the waterfront in the small town of Valdez. The docks were crowded with families and happy kids. Suddenly, a strange roar filled the air. Jackson's body shook. But wait, it wasn't just his body that was shaking. Everything around him was shaking too. And then a woman screamed, "Earthquake!" The roaring got louder, hammering Jackson's ears. The ground shook harder, knocking him down to his knees. The freezing water in the harbor seemed to boil like an evil witch's brew. On the streets, cars swerved and spun. Trees and telephone poles swayed. The roaring got louder. The shaking got harder. Louder. Harder. Louder. Harder. Jackson tried to stand up, but it wasn't possible. The ground seemed to have come alive, rising and falling, twisting and rolling. For Jackson, it was like riding on top of a giant squirming snake. He clawed his way forward on his hands and knees, inching his way across the shaking ground. He had finally made it out to the street when, crack, a massive gash opened in the ground right in front of him. Jackson turned around, but, crack, an even bigger gash tore open behind him. A sickening stench rose from the darkness below. Jackson tried not to think of what could be waiting for him down there. Boiling lava? Shooting flames? The slobbering mouth of a hungry beast? The ground under him started to crumble apart. "Please, please, no!" Jackson screamed. But down he fell, helpless and terrified, into the darkness. Chapter 2. 3 weeks earlier, Monday, March 9th, 1964, 4:30 in the afternoon, 120 miles from Valdez, deep in the wilderness. "I don't think we'll be having fish for dinner tonight," Mom said, flicking a small icicle from her eyelash. Jackson peered down into the hole he and Dad had chopped through the thick river ice. They'd been fishing for hours. So far, not even a nibble. Needles of cold jabbed at Jackson's toes. It wasn't too cold today, around 5 degrees, but he still should have worn a third pair of socks. Jackson stared down into the dark water. "I know you're down there, fish," Dad chuckled, and Mom let out one of her famous barking laughs. She sounded like a seal. "A very jolly seal," Dad always said. It was that laugh that had caught Dad's attention all those years ago, when he and Mom were in college in Ohio. Back then, Dad was already dreaming of living on his own in the Alaskan bush. That's what people called the wild parts of Alaska, that were far from roads and towns. It turned out Mom was ready for an adventure too. They came up here after college, found a patch of land near the river, and started building the cabin. What a disaster. Eyeing his parents, Jackson thought of all the horror stories they told him about their first year in the bush. They ran out of food halfway through the winter. They got lost in the forest and nearly froze. Mom ate a poisonous mushroom and puked her guts out for a week. Finally, it was summer, and they were practically eaten alive by swarms of bloodthirsty Alaska mosquitoes. We were idiots, Mom liked to say. We had no idea what we were doing. We almost died 10 times, Dad would add, shaking his head. But each mistake taught Mom and Dad something new. And when they weren't hungry or freezing or being devoured by bloodsuckers, they were falling more and more in love with each other and with the wild land around them. Jackson was born 2 years later. He'd spent his whole life in the tiny cabin Mom and Dad had built about 2 miles from the river. Lucky me, Jackson thought, smiling to himself and giving his freezing toes a wiggle. So, what should we have for dinner? Dad asked. How about moose stew? Mom said. Or we could have moose burgers or moose meatloaf or moose meatballs. Or moose chili, Jackson asked. Oh, that would hit the spot, Dad said. Moose chili it is, Mom said. By this time of year, they were all sick to death of moose meat. It was their main food in the winter. Most other animals they could eat were hiding underground or hibernating during the coldest months. One male moose had 600 pounds of meat. They'd hunt one down, butcher the animal, cut up the meat, and preserve it in jars they sealed shut in boiling water. By now, Jackson had eaten so much moose meat, he was surprised he didn't have antlers. But he never complained. 3 years ago, they couldn't find a moose before winter blasted in. They barely had any meat all winter. Luckily, they had their winter supply of rice and beans and noodles. But they had to be careful, because if they ran out, they couldn't just drive to a store. They had no car. There were no roads in the bush. The nearest store was in a town about 20 miles away. No, living here wasn't always easy. Their cabin had no electricity or running water. Their toilet was a hole in the ground. The forest was filled with grizzlies and wolves. A person had to be tough to live in the bush. Alaska tough. Jackson looked around now, shivering a little. His toes were numb, but he smiled to himself as he looked up the river. It curled like an icy blue ribbon through the thick green forest. He'd always felt lucky to live in such an amazing place. Mom led the way on the 2-mile journey back home. The sun was starting to go down when the cabin finally came into sight. It was small and plain, just 4 walls made of logs, with moss stuffed into the cracks to keep out the cold. They were a few steps from the porch when Mom stopped short. "What's wrong?" Dad asked. Mom pointed at something in the snow, huge paw prints, scattered all around them. Jackson's stomach clenched as Dad slid his rifle off his shoulder. Only one animal left a track like that. A grizzly. Chapter 3. Jackson dropped to his knees and studied one of the paw prints. It was massive, bigger than his own 2 hands put together. The toes were spread about an inch apart. Above each toe print was a dot. Those were where the tips of the bear's slashing claws dug deep into the snow. Grizzly for sure. Jackson had learned to read animal tracks before he'd learned his ABCs. "This makes no sense," Jackson said, standing up. "How could a grizzly be here?" At this time in March, bears were supposed to still be hibernating. During the fall, they gorged themselves on roots and fish and whatever food they could find. Then they curled up in the hollow trees or beneath rocky ledges and went into a kind of sleep. They stayed hidden away until at least late April. That was one good thing about winter in Alaska, not worrying about grizzlies. "It's a winter bear," Mom said in a low voice. The two words, winter bear, turned Jackson's blood to ice. It was what they called a grizzly that came out of hibernation before it was supposed to. Winter bears were rare. Jackson had never seen one with his own eyes. But he'd heard terrifying stories about bears that crawled out of their dens way too early, desperately hungry. But where could a bear find food in the winter? Fish were sealed away under the thick ice. Small animals were tunneled into winter dens, deep below the frozen ground. Berry bushes were bare. That's why winter bears found their way to cabins, to humans. It was rare for a grizzly bear to attack a person. But winter bears were different. They would eat anything, or anyone they could find. "Stay close together," Mom said now. Dad clutched his rifle. He'd never shoot an animal unless he had a good reason. Jackson hoped this wasn't one of those times. Jackson narrowed his eyes, searching for the bear in the gathering darkness. He saw a pile of its scat, grizzly poop, and more huge paw prints, but he couldn't see the bear anywhere. "Could it be gone?" Mom asked. Jackson's hopes rose, but then came a loud crash from inside the cabin. Jackson's heart stopped. The winter bear, the beast, was in their home. "We have to stop it," Mom cried, lunging forward. "Deb," Dad barked, grabbing Mom's arm. "You know that's too dangerous." "But, Bruce, all our food." The jars that filled their kitchen shelves, the preserved moose meat, jams, and berries, the can of salmon they were saving for Dad's birthday next month, bags and boxes of rice and beans and noodles. The grizzly would knock all the jars onto the floor, shattering the glass. It would slash through the bags and boxes, bite through the cans. The bear would eat it all. What it left behind would be filthy and ruined. Jackson took a breath, trying to calm himself. But then he heard other sounds. Crackle, pop. Jackson's eyes widened as smoke started seeping from under the front door of the cabin. "Fire!" Jackson shouted. Dad whispered a curse. The bear must have knocked over the stove. Their heavy metal stove, which kept them warm, where Mom cooked their food, they always tamped down the fire before they left the cabin. But a grizzly could have knocked it over, scattering glowing embers, bits of wood that could ignite a fire. Whoosh! Jackson leaped back as flames shot through the cabin roof. The darkening sky glowed blood red, and showers of sparks filled the air. Panic shot through Jackson's body, but there was nothing he, or anyone, could do. There was no fire department here, no neighbors to rush over with buckets and hoses. Suddenly, the cabin door burst open. The grizzly staggered through a curtain of smoke. The bear was small and thin. One of its pointed ears was ragged and torn. It looked at them and let out a weak, rasping cry. Dad aimed his rifle, but the bear vanished into the darkness. Jackson stared ahead as the cabin crumbled away inside the orange, twisting flames. Everything he and Mom and Dad owned was inside. Not just the food, but clothes. Jackson's homeschooling books and supplies. Quilts Mom had sewn. Furniture Jackson had helped Dad build. Soon, it would all be gone. And what about Mom and Dad and Jackson? What would happen to them? How would they even make it through this freezing night? Chapter 4. Jackson fought tears and tried to steady his heart. It was beating so hard he could hear it pounding in his ears. Boom, boom, boom. Mom must have heard it too. "Hey," she said, gripping his shoulders. "We're going to be all right." Jackson wanted to believe Mom, but how would they all be all right? Without their cabin, they'd freeze. Without their food, they'd starve. And what if the winter bear came back? Jackson stared at the burning cabin, as if the answer might appear through the flames and smoke. "You know what we have to do," Mom said in a low voice. "We have to get to work." Get to work. That was a Barrett family saying, almost like a prayer. It was what they said when something bad happened, when all you wanted to do was curl into a ball and give up. It meant, get a grip on yourself, stop whining, get busy staying alive. Like that day last winter when Jackson was out rabbit hunting on his own. He'd been about a mile from the cabin when suddenly the sky got dark. Gray clouds cracked open, snow poured down in thick sheets. Jackson couldn't see 2 inches ahead of him. There was no way he'd make it home. Jackson was so scared he couldn't think straight. He'd run through the trees, slipped, and then bam! Down he went, hard onto his back. He'd struggled to his feet, then stomped around blindly until he tripped again. Bam! This time, he fell flat on his face. He bit his tongue so hard his mouth filled with blood. He lay there as the snow poured down. "I'm done," he'd thought. Dad once told Jackson that there were 1,000 ways to die in Alaska. He'd meant it as a kind of joke. There definitely weren't 1,000, probably more like 50, and freezing to death in a blizzard had to be in the top 5. Blinded by snow, people roamed around and around in circles until they were too exhausted to take another step. Finally, they dropped to the ground and gave up. Their bodies disappeared under a blanket of snow until the spring, when the wolves and vultures found them and picked their bones clean. Jackson had imagined his own shining bones. "That's going to be me," he thought. And then a voice had whispered through his mind, "Get to work." And then louder, "Get to work." His mind suddenly cleared. He'd stood up and slipped off his beat-up army backpack, which was packed with emergency supplies. A compass and flashlight in case he got lost. Emergency matches for building a fire. Moose jerky and dried blueberries for energy. A whistle to scare away threatening animals. A rope to lower himself down from cliffs. And a shovel, in case he ever got caught in a blizzard. Jackson had used the shovel to dig himself a big hole under a spruce tree. When the hole was good and deep, he climbed inside. He'd tugged his parka hood over his head and pulled his knees to his chest. Huddled in his little snow cave, he'd stayed surprisingly warm and dry. After 2 hours, the snow stopped. Jackson would never forget the looks on Mom's and Dad's faces when he walked through the cabin door. How quickly their worry turned to pride. That was the moment Jackson knew he was tough. Alaska tough. And right now, as the hissing fire destroyed their cabin, Jackson dug deep for that feeling again. Yes, it was freezing cold. Overnight, it would get even colder. The winter bear was still out there. That's why he couldn't waste time standing around whimpering. Jackson took a deep breath and stood taller. "Okay," he said to Mom. "Let's get to work." Chapter 5. About 20 yards from the cabin were 2 big steel drums, each the size of a large garbage can. Dad used his knife to pry open the bear-proof lids. Inside was everything they needed to keep from freezing and starving to death. A sturdy tent, sleeping bags, flashlights, a first aid kit, a camping stove, and a pot to melt snow for water. Plus, there was enough moose jerky to feed them for a few days. Of course, Mom and Dad had made sure they were prepared, even for this. The sounds of the fire filled the air. Sizzle, crackle, hiss. Boom! A window shattered. The thick smoke burned Jackson's nose. Falling embers sizzled as they brushed against his face. But Jackson ignored the sounds and the smells and the pinpricks of pain. He barely glanced at the fire's twisting flames. He kept his mind focused on the work of loading the supplies onto the sled. When everything was piled on top, they dragged it to a spot far from the cabin. That way they'd be safe from flying sparks and embers. As they set up the tent, Mom and Dad worked out their plan. "We'll stay here tonight," Dad said, grabbing a tent pole. "At sunrise, we'll leave for Glenallen." That was the closest town, 20 miles away. In the summer, they'd take their canoe down the river and get there in a day. But it was winter, and the river was frozen. They'd have to walk. A 3-day journey. If they were lucky. Jackson tried not to imagine what could happen to them on such a long trek in the winter. They could get slammed by a blizzard. They could fall through river ice. And that winter bear. But he understood why they couldn't just stay here and live in their tent. It was too cold. And just like the winter bear, they wouldn't be able to find enough food. The calendar said that the first day of spring was only a couple of weeks away. What a joke. Here in Alaska, the freezing weather could stick around for months after that. "We'll call Uncle Solly from the general store," Mom said, spreading out a tarp over the snowy ground. "He'll drive up to Glenallen to get us." Uncle Solly. Just hearing that name helped Jackson relax. Uncle Solly was Mom and Dad's best friend. Jackson's too. He lived in Valdez, a busy town on the sea about 100 miles south of Glenallen. Jackson, Mom, and Dad stayed in Valdez with Uncle Solly every summer. Those 3-week trips were a chance to take a short break from the wilderness. They'd stock up on food for the winter, see the doctor and the dentist, and go on adventures with Uncle Solly. Uncle Solly lived in a small cottage not far from the busy Valdez waterfront. Jackson felt like a prince as he took hot showers and used the toilet, which was inside the house. And the store-bought food, milk, eggs, chips, cookies, ice cream. Jackson stuffed himself at every meal. But 3 weeks in Valdez was always enough for Jackson. The noise, the cars, the people, it was all too much. He never liked saying goodbye to Uncle Sully, but he couldn't wait to get back home to the quiet of the bush. "How long will we stay in Valdez?" Jackson asked as he pounded a tent pole into the frozen ground. "Dad and I will have to get jobs," Mom said. "We're going to need to save up money to buy supplies to rebuild." "Maybe we can get back here by August," Dad said. 4 months. Already, that seemed like forever. Chapter 6. 4 days later, Friday, March 13th, 1964. 4:45 a.m., Valdez, Alaska. Roar! The winter bear was in the cabin, and now it had come for Jackson, and there was no escape. Jackson stared in horror at the bear's dripping teeth, smelled its bloody breath. He braced himself for the bone-crunching bite. And then Jackson's eyes snapped open. It took a few seconds for his groggy head to clear. There was no bear. He wasn't in the cabin. He and Mom and Dad had made it to Valdez last night. They'd gone to sleep in Uncle Solly's guest room. Jackson could hear Mom and Dad breathing softly from their bed a few feet away. In the moonlight, he could see the clock on the dresser, 4:45 a.m. Jackson pulled the quilt around him. He shivered as he remembered the 3 bitterly cold nights they'd spent in their tent. His bones and muscles ached from the 20-mile walk. But they'd been lucky. No blizzards, no sign of the winter bear. They'd made it to Glen Allen with no trouble. The owners of the general store made them bowls of chili while they waited for Uncle Sully. By sunset last night, they were finally here, safe and sound. Jackson eyed the clock again. Should he get out of bed now? Back home, Jackson was always up at 5 o'clock. That way, he could do some of his homework before chores. But his school supplies and books were all burned up now. It felt so good to be warm. Just a few more minutes, Jackson thought, closing his eyes. The next time Jackson woke up, the sun was streaming through the window. Mom and Dad's bed was empty. He looked at the clock. What? 8 o'clock? He'd never slept that late in his life. One night in Valdez, and already he turned into a lazy slug. He scrambled out of bed and threw on his clothes. They stank of smoke and sweat and moose jerky. In a flash, he was down the stairs. "Good morning," Uncle Solly boomed when Jackson walked into the cozy kitchen. He was at the stove. Mom and Dad were sipping coffee at the table. Jackson was glad to see his parents looking cheerful and bright-eyed. They'd all been dragging last night when they finally got to Valdez. "Sorry I slept so late," Jackson said. "I could have slept all day," Mom said with a yawn. "Be glad you weren't up early," Uncle Sully said to Jackson. "You escaped helping me shovel the driveway. It snowed last night. Again." Jackson looked out the window. Whoa! There was at least a foot of fresh snow on top of the 5 feet that had been there last night. Drifts rose up past the first floor window of the house next door. "Did you know we get more snow here in Valdez than anywhere else in Alaska?" Uncle Solly said as he cracked an egg into a sizzling skillet. Dad and Mom smirked at Jackson over their mugs of coffee. Uncle Solly loved reminding them that Valdez was extra special. "Most beautiful town in Alaska," he would brag. "Everyone agrees." Out the window, Jackson could see straight down the street to the waterfront. Fishing boats bobbed in the bright blue water. Across the harbor, a zigzag of sparkling mountains rose into the morning sky. It was pretty, Jackson thought, but he missed the pine trees that surrounded the cabin. Uncle Solly put a heaping plate of fluffy eggs, thick bacon, and toast in front of Jackson. "Now, that is beautiful," Jackson thought. They never got to eat eggs at the cabin. Uncle Solly's toast was made with the squishy white store-bought bread Jackson loved. "Thanks, Uncle Solly," Jackson said as he shoveled the first forkful into his mouth. "You won't believe it," Mom said, sitting back in her chair. "Dad and I already have jobs." "How did that happen?" Jackson asked through a mouthful. "Uncle Solly hired us," Dad said. Uncle Solly turned from the stove, his smile bright under his big, bushy mustache. He was a carpenter, and it turned out he needed help with a new house he was building. "I'm lucky you showed up," he said. "We're the lucky ones," Mom said, smiling at Uncle Solly. "You've always been there for us." That was true. Mom and Dad had met Uncle Solly during their miserable first year in Alaska. He was living in the bush back then, in a cabin about 6 miles from theirs. When Mom and Dad ran out of food that winter, Uncle Solly shared his. He taught them about hunting and fishing and living off the land. Without Uncle Solly's help, Mom and Dad always said they wouldn't have survived the winter. "Uncle Solly," Jackson said, swallowing his last bite of eggs, "I'll help with that house, too." It was the least he could do to show his thanks to Uncle Solly. Plus, he needed more practice if he was going to help Mom and Dad rebuild the cabin. "Jackson," Mom said, "you're not going to have time to work. You'll be in school." "I can get my schoolwork done early in the morning," Jackson said, mopping up the last of his eggs with a crust of toast. He and Mom had always managed to squeeze the 3 or 4 hours of school into their busy days. "We can't homeschool you from here," Mom said. "I'm going to be working too much. Dad and I are going to sign you up at the elementary school down the street. You'll start Monday." Jackson dropped his toast. "I can't do that," he said. He'd never set foot inside an actual school, but he knew what it would be like. A grumpy grandma type as a teacher. Lessons so boring he'd fall asleep. 6 hours a day stuck at a desk. Jackson was used to spending his days outside, always on the move. Going to school would be like being in jail. "Come on," Dad said with a frown. "Millions of kids go to school every day." "It's only for a couple of months," Mom said. "You'll make some friends." Jackson didn't need friends. Thank you. He'd always gotten by on his own. And besides, what did he have in common with stuck-up town kids? He opened his mouth to explain all this, but then he shut it again. Mom and Dad had made up their minds, and Jackson wasn't a whiner. He'd made it through a blizzard. He'd trudged 20 miles in the freezing cold. He was pretty sure he was tough enough for 5th grade. Chapter 7. 3 days later, Monday, March 16th, 1964, around 8 a.m., Valdez Elementary School. "Welcome, Jackson. I'm Miss Lawrence. Please come in." Jackson stood in the doorway of the classroom and tried to hide his surprise. This teacher was no grumpy grandma type. She was young and tall, with long black hair and a bright smile. Jackson scanned the classroom. It was sunny, with colorful maps and posters on the walls. About 20 kids sat at desks lined up in rows. The boys all had short hair and were dressed in neat shirts and pants. Jackson glanced at his rumpled, second-hand flannel shirt Mom had found yesterday in a church used clothes bin. He patted down his overgrown curls. Maybe he should have cut his hair. Too late now. "Class, this is Jackson," Miss Lawrence said brightly. "Hello, Jackson," the class all said together. Jackson's stomach started to churn, and the pancakes and 2 glasses of milk from breakfast sloshed around in his stomach. Was he going to puke? All over the floor? He'd never been to school before, but he was pretty sure puking was the worst thing that could happen to a kid. He took a breath. Get a grip. Miss Lawrence led him to the closet where he could hang his coat and leave his lunchbox. He took off his beat-up army backpack, still filled with his emergency supplies. No, he probably didn't need them here in Valdez, but you never know. Miss Lawrence pointed out an empty desk in the middle of the room. As Jackson sat down, a girl with short brown hair and cat-eye glasses leaned over and smiled. "I'm Leonore." "I'm Chris," said a short but muscular boy with fox-colored hair. "I'm Nora," whispered a smiling girl with long yellow braids. "I'm Mary," said the rosy-cheeked girl next to her. Other kids looked at Jackson and waved. None of them seemed stuck up, as far as Jackson could tell. "Jackson," Miss Lawrence said, "you're just in time for our morning geography lesson. Is everyone ready?" "Yes, Miss Lawrence," everyone sang. She stood in front of a big map of Alaska that hung in the front of the room. Jackson's stomach settled. Finally, the kids weren't all staring at him. "Alaska's capital is," Miss Lawrence said. "Juneau," chanted the class. "Biggest city?" "Anchorage." "When did Alaska become a state?" 1959. "When did people first come to Alaska?" It was quiet for a few seconds. A few kids tried. "In the 1800s? During the gold rush?" Miss Lawrence shook her head. 1700s? Russian explorers?" "No," Miss Lawrence said. "During the Ice Age," Nora called out. Miss Lawrence smiled. "Yes." Wow, Jackson thought. That was a long time ago. "Nobody knows exactly when the first people came to Alaska," Miss Lawrence said. "But it was definitely more than 10,000 years ago. And some of those people were my ancestors. As you know, I am Unangics. That's one of the main Alaskan Native cultural groups," Jackson thought, thinking back to the books he and Mom had read about Alaska. There are many groups. Inupiaq, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, Yup-Ik, Cup-Ik, Athabaskan, Eyak, Simshan, Tlingit, Haida, Sugpiaq, and each is different. They have different languages and customs, different myths and arts. "Hey, Miss Lawrence," Chris said with a sneaky grin. "You don't look 10,000 years old." Kids giggled, and Miss Lawrence let out a big laugh, almost as loud as Mom's. "I was not born during the Ice Age, thank you," she said. "Where did your ancestors come from, Miss Lawrence?" Leonore asked. Miss Lawrence pointed to a big piece of land across the sea from Alaska. "They came from here," she said. "Today it's called Siberia." She went on to explain that the sea between Siberia and Alaska was called the Bering Sea. "But back during the Ice Age, the land and oceans around the world looked very different. Part of the Bering Sea was dry land, so people could walk across to Alaska. Staring at the map, Jackson tried to imagine what a hard journey that must have been. And what was Alaska like during the Ice Age? Even colder and icier than today. There were fewer trees to cut down and burn to stay warm, and even scarier animals, like saber-toothed tigers, giant wolves, and bears twice as big as today's grizzlies. Jackson shuddered. "Jackson?" Miss Lawrence said, jolting Jackson out of his thoughts. "Where were you living before you came to Valdez?" How should he answer that? "About 20 miles from Glenallen," he said. "Come up and show us on the map," Miss Lawrence said with a wave. Jackson stood up. With every step toward the map, his beat-up work boots squeaked on the tiles. He pushed his curls out of his eyes so he could find Glenallen on the map. Then he pointed to a spot nearby where the blue line of the Copper River curved north. Miss Lawrence stared. "How exciting! You were living in the bush?" Jackson nodded. "Wow!" someone shouted. Jackson thought it might be Chris. "For how long?" Miss Lawrence asked. "My whole life," Jackson said. "But our cabin burned down a week ago, so that's why we're here." The ferocious winter bear from his nightmare flashed into Jackson's mind. His stomach twisted. This time he really was going to puke. For sure. Be right back," Jackson muttered. Then he bolted for the classroom door. Chapter 8. Jackson ran down the halls. He'd seen the boys' room on his walk to the classroom, but now he couldn't find it. After 3 wrong turns, he finally made it. He pushed his way into a stall and stood there. His heart pounded. Sweat dripped down his back. But the queasy feeling passed. A minute later, the outside door creaked open. "Jackson?" "Miss Lawrence." Jackson stepped out of the stall. Miss Lawrence was right outside the boys' room, with the door open just a crack. "Do you need to see the nurse?" she said. "Nurse?" "Last winter Jackson's nearly cut his finger off chopping wood. The blood soaked his shirt. Mom sewed up the deep cut with a needle and thread. Jackson bit down on a stick so he wouldn't yell out in pain with every stab of the needle. Jackson didn't need a nurse for a queasy stomach. "No, thank you," he said. Miss Lawrence put her hand on his shoulder as they walked back to the classroom. "You'll feel better," she said. "First days are hard." "Thanks," Jackson said, breaking away. He knew Miss Lawrence was trying to be nice, but she didn't understand. He wasn't some spoiled town kid. He'd grown up in the brush. The rest of the morning went okay. Luckily, kids didn't make a big deal about him rushing out of the room. Leonore leaned over and quietly asked him if he was okay, but that was it. It turned out Jackson was way ahead of most kids in math. He whipped through his long division problems. In grammar, they worked on commas, which Mom had taught him about last year. And the work wasn't boring. Miss Lawrence cracked jokes and even made stuff interesting. Jackson didn't fall asleep once. Plus, they had music class. Jackson didn't know any of the songs, but he liked listening to the other kids sing. When it was time for lunch, the kids all took their lunchboxes to the cafeteria. The noise in there was louder than a thunderstorm in the bush. The giggles and shrieks of the kids, the shouts of the frazzled-looking teacher trying to get the little kids to stop throwing food, the banging of chairs and slamming of metal lunchboxes. And Jackson had barely bitten into his bologna and cheese sandwich when kids started asking him questions about the bush. "What did you eat? Where did you sleep? Did you have electricity? How did you take a shower?" Jackson answered as best as he could. The kids were especially amazed to hear how he had to lug water from the creek just to wash dishes or take a bath. "It sounds really fun," Leonore said. "Like a camping trip." "Sure," Jackson thought. That's what Mom and Dad thought when they first got to the bush. Then they almost died 10 times. But no reason to tell these kids any of that. "I don't know," Nora said, nibbling on a chip. "I couldn't live without electricity." "I'd miss listening to music," Mary said. In music class, Jackson had noticed that Mary had the best singing voice. "I'd miss my Twinkies," Chris added, picking up one of the vanilla cakes and giving it a kiss. The kids all laughed, even Jackson. "What's the most amazing thing you've ever seen?" Leonard asked, leaning forward. Jackson felt all their eyes on him, but surprisingly, he didn't get queasy like before. He thought about some of his favorite moments in the bush. A huge rainbow he saw after a big storm last summer. The sound of thousands of birds starting to sing at once right before the springtime sunrise. The time he saw an eagle snatch a huge salmon from the river with its pointy talon toes. To Jackson, every day in the bush was amazing. But he was pretty sure these town kids didn't want to hear about sunsets and birds. They wanted blood, guts, and snarls. Jackson had the perfect story. Chapter 9. "I had spent the day fishing," Jackson said, wishing he could take all these kids back to that day. It was last June. The birds had come back from their winter getaways. Moose calves, fox kits, bear cubs, and baby rabbits were scampering around the forest with their mothers. On the way back to the cabin, I climbed up onto a high ridge that overlooked the valley. That view popped into Jackson's mind. The endless green forest, the bright sparkle of the river, how the snow-topped mountains looked as if they were wearing diamond crowns. When I got to the top, I looked down, and right below me, maybe 15 feet down, was a pack of wolves. The kids all gasped. "A whole pack?" Mary said. "I'd pee my pants if I saw a wolf pack," Chris said. Leonard elbowed him. "That's gross." "Sorry," Chris said. "It's true." Jackson understood why most people would be scared. Wolves were fierce predators, fast and tough, with jaws strong enough to bite through bones. But Jackson shook his head. "Wolves don't usually bother with humans," Jackson explained. "At least, not in the summer, when there was plenty of food. Plus, I was up on those rocks. They couldn't get up there. And there was a strong wind blowing toward me. I could smell the wolves, but they couldn't pick up my scent." Jackson could see the wolves so clearly. The pups scampered around, tackling one another, rolling in the mud like furry little wrestlers. The grown-ups lounged in the sun like they didn't have a worry in the world. And then, out of nowhere, this huge grizzly came crashing out of the woods. "Yikes!" Chris yelped. For a second, Jackson wondered if he should stop. Was this too scary for them? "Go on," Nora said, and the others nodded. "Guess not." "The bear was massive," Jackson said. "I'd say it had to weigh 1,000 pounds. He remembered how the bear's muscle had ripped under its fur. "Grizzlies are way bigger and stronger than wolves," Jackson pointed out. "One swipe of a grizzly's paw can crack a skull or slice open a wolf's belly." "That's gotta hurt," Chris said with a wince. "Poor wolves," Mary cried. "But here's the thing," Jackson said, lowering his voice. It surprised him that the kids were so interested. "Wolves don't fight alone. They fight as a pack. They stick together." He described how the grizzly went after one wolf, and how the other wolves came up behind the bear. They growled and snarled and snapped at the bear's legs. They stood their ground, protecting one another. "Did it work?" Nora asked. Jackson nodded. "The grizzly gave up eventually. It ran into the woods." "The wolves win?" Chris cried out, raising his arms. All the kids smiled. "That was a really amazing story, Jackson," Leonard said. "Better than a movie," Mary agreed. Jackson sat back and took a deep breath. He was glad the kids liked his story, but he'd never talked so much in one day in his entire life. He could use some peace and quiet. Except at recess, the kids wanted to play hide and seek. "Chris is it," Nora shouted. Jackson played for a while, but as the kids were scattered around hiding behind piles of snow, Jackson realized this was his chance to steal some time for himself. He hurried all the way around the back of the school, far from the playground. He squeezed himself behind a shed and sat down. Finally, some peace. "You're a good hider," Leonore said when the bell rang and Jackson finally came out of his spot. The rest of the afternoon crept along. By 3 o'clock, Jackson's head was pounding. He couldn't wait to get home. But he was putting on his parka. Chris came up to him. "Jackson," he said as he was zigging it up. "Want to come with us to Leonore's?" "She has the new Beatles," Nora said. "The new Beatles?" Jackson asked, picturing shiny bugs inside a box. That made no sense. Leonore must have noticed he was confused. "They're a band," she smiled. "The Beatles." How could he know that? And what a dumb name for a band. "Wait until you hear their songs," Mary said. "You'll love them." "And Leonore has a hula hoop," Nora said. Hula hoop? What in the world was that? Back in the bush, Jackson could name any bird by listening to its song. He knew every flower by its smell. He could find his way home by looking at the sun or the stars. But standing here, Jackson felt completely lost. His stomach started churning again. "It will be fun. Leonore has some new silly putty." "Silly what?" He had to get out of here. Now. "Thanks," Jackson said, hurrying down the hallway. "But I need to get back home." He rushed out of the classroom and down the hall. He pushed through the heavy front door of the school, sucking in the cold, fresh air. Free! He'd made it through his first day. He tried not to think of how he would make it through the rest. Chapter 10. 10 days later. Thursday, March 26th, 1964. By the end of the second week, Jackson had school figured out. He could remember all the words to the Pledge of Allegiance. He'd learned every verse of "My Country, 'Tis of Thee," which they sang together after the pledge. He could get to the boys' room with his eyes closed. As for the kids, Jackson had decided it was easier to just stay away. Half the time he didn't understand what they were talking about. He'd stand there feeling all confused, like a moose calf lost in the woods. What was the point of even trying to figure out what a hula hoop was? Or why this Beatle band was so great? Soon, he'd be back in the bush where he belonged. None of that stuff would matter. He'd never see these kids again. At lunchtime, he skipped the cafeteria and slipped right out to the playground. He'd pick out a quiet spot behind a giant pile of snow. That way he could eat his sandwich in peace. He avoided the recess games of hide and seek. When Leonore would invite him over after school, Jackson would make up an excuse. Same with Mary's ice skating party and sledding at Nora's. Finally, kids stopped asking him to do things. They didn't try to include him in their talks about bands or toys or games. They didn't ask him to tell any more exciting stories about the bush. These past few days, nobody at school talked to Jackson much at all, except for Miss Lawrence, which was what Jackson wanted, right? That Thursday morning, the class was buzzing with excitement. Easter weekend was coming up. School was closed tomorrow for Good Friday. All morning, kids chattered about their holiday plans. There were family dinners, an Easter egg hunt, a basketball game at the high school, ice skating at the pond. But what the kids were most excited about was a big supply ship that would be docking in Valdez tomorrow afternoon. It was called the Chena, and it was coming from Seattle. Jackson had already heard about it from Uncle Solly. His close buddy was a member of the crew. Uncle Solly was hoping to see him while the ship was docked. "Half the town will be there to watch the Chena unload," Uncle Solly had said. "Everyone is waiting for something that's on that ship." The stores in town were running low on food and other things, Uncle Solly had explained. Fresh fruits and vegetables, toilet paper, batteries, parts for cars. Just yesterday, Jackson had heard Chris complaining that the market was out of Twinkies. "I'm going to starve," he moaned. Pretty much everything people bought at stores in Alaska came from the lower 48. That's what people in Alaska called the other parts of the United States. Everywhere but Alaska and Hawaii. Alaska had lots of trees and animals and fish, but not many farms or factories. Even Mom and Dad and Jackson needed to buy things, like their parkas and boots and the kerosene for the lamps, their fishing gear and wood stove, and, of course, the extra food they needed for the winter: rice, noodles, oatmeal, beans. They wouldn't be able to live in the bush without all that stuff. Thinking about all this, Jackson eyed Miss Lawrence as she wrote out long division problems on the blackboard. He tried to picture her ancestors trudging across the icy bridge. There were no stores or ships back then. People had to get everything from the land, every bite of food, every scrap of clothing. They invented new ways to hunt and fish. They figured out how to build warm houses and fast boats from caribou hide or the bark of trees. They'd found ways to live, to have families, to stay in Alaska for all these centuries. Talk about Alaska tough, Jackson thought. At recess that day, Jackson had found a new pile of snow where he could sit on his own. He'd just finished his sandwich when he heard kids talking nearby. He recognized some of the voices: Nora, Mary, Leonore, Chris. They couldn't see him, but he could hear what they were talking about. "The Chena is the best ship," a boy was saying. "Last year, I got 3 lollipops," said Mary. "I got chocolate," said another girl. "I got an orange," Nora said proudly. An orange? Jackson had never even seen one of those. He listened as Nora told how she brought it home and saved it for days. "What did it taste like?" someone asked her. "Like sunshine," she said. Jackson smiled a little as he tried to imagine what sunshine might taste like. Nora always knew how to describe things, Jackson had noticed. The kids bickered over when it would be best to meet at the waterfront. In the end, they decided on 5 o'clock. "Should we invite Jackson?" Leonore asked. Jackson's ears perked up. Maybe this was one time he'd say yes. He'd like to get his hands on a real orange. "He won't come," Mary said. Don't even bother asking him, Nora said. Yeah, Chris added. He hates us. Jackson blinked, like he'd been slapped. That kid's weird, said another boy. What's with that backpack? Who carries an army backpack to school? Jackson stared at his backpack. Don't be mean, Leonore said. Maybe he'd like us if we had fur and tails, Chris said. A couple of kids snickered. Jackson's cheek burned, like he was sitting too close to a fire. The bell rang. Jackson heard the kids' crunching footsteps as they hurried back toward the school. He had to stop himself from chasing after them. I don't hate you, he wanted to shout, but it was too late for that, because now they all hated him. Chapter 11. The next day, Friday, March 27th, 1964. Mom and Dad and Uncle Sully rushed through breakfast. Even though school was closed for Good Friday, they still had work to do on the house they were building. Jackson planned to spend the day doing chores for Uncle Sully. He hadn't slept well last night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the kid's voice from the playground. He hates us. That kid's weird. Maybe he'd like us if we had fur and tails. Hopefully, shoveling snow and splitting wood would help him clear his head. Jackson, Uncle Sully said as he was putting on his boots, you remember that ship that's coming this afternoon? The China? Jackson nodded. How could he forget? I need you to go down to the loading dock and get a note to my buddy in the crew. I'm not going to make it down to see him tonight. We're going to be working late at that house. Sure, Jackson said. Going down to the dock was the last thing Jackson wanted to do. Every kid in his class would be on that dock. But he couldn't say no to Uncle Sully. He'd just have to avoid the kids. Uncle Sully scrawled out a note and handed it to Jackson. Give it to any of the sailors you see, he said. Get there around 5:30. Would the kids be gone by then? Jackson hoped so. At 5:15, Jackson grabbed his backpack and headed down to the waterfront. It was barely a 5-minute walk. He distracted himself. Jackson thought of all the fun times he'd had with Uncle Sully over the years. Heading out of the harbor in Uncle Sully's little boat, they'd explored the coves and bays tucked between the mountains. There was always something to see. A walrus with dagger tusks, dolphins dancing in the waves, furry sea otters floating around on rafts they made from kelp. Best of all was the humpback whale Jackson spotted a couple of years ago. It broke the surface of the bay, a massive creature more than 50 feet long. Water shot out of the blowhole on its back before it sank down again. A moment later, it exploded up out of the water. Arcing its back, it seemed to hover in the air before disappearing. Shimmering splash that drenched Jackson and Uncle Sully. Jackson's chest tightened as he thought of those happy summer days. He wondered what Leonore would have said about the whale, or how Nora would have described it. Did Mary know any songs about whales? And what kind of joke would Chris have told to crack them all up? Jackson would never know. And why should he care? Jackson pulled his parka tighter around him as a bitter wind blew from the harbor. At least it wasn't snowing. Jackson came to the end of Alaska Avenue. Just ahead of him was the waterfront. It was like a separate little town sitting right on the harbor. Different docks, warehouses for fish and cargo, a salmon cannery where fish were cut up and packed into cans. Jackson could see the China floating with its right side up against the main loading dock. It was at least 10 times as long as a humpback whale. Jackson crossed a busy street and stepped onto a bridge that headed out over the water to the docks. Uncle Solly had been right. At least half the town was here. Cars were parked up and down the street. Kids skipped past Jackson, their parents chasing behind. A truck rumbled by and the bridge shook. Jackson stepped off the bridge and onto the main loading dock. Dock workers lugged crates into the warehouse. A forklift zipped past. Jackson walked slowly toward the ship, reaching into his pocket for Uncle Solly's note. He looked around, but didn't see any sailors to give it to. The only sailor he could see was above him, on the deck of the China. The man was leaning over the railing, smiling down at a group of little kids gathered below. "Who wants an apple?" he sang. "I do," cried a little girl in a pink hat. The man tossed the fruit down. "Got it!" She clutched the apple to her chest like it was a gold nugget. "How about a chocolate bar?" the man called. "Me, me, me!" a little boy squealed. Jackson watched until he spotted a sailor leaving the ship. Jackson hurried over to him and asked if he could deliver the note. "Happy to," the sailor said. Jackson thanked him and darted away. Now he could get out of here. But halfway across the bridge, Jackson spotted 4 kids walking toward him. Without a second look, he knew it was Leonore, Chris, Nora, and Mary. They were all laughing. Leonore gave Chris a playful push. Mary and Nora linked their arms together and skipped ahead. Jackson remembered those scampering wolf pups he'd watched from the cliff last summer. That's what these kids reminded him of, a wolf pack. He felt an ache in his chest, a lonely kind of ache. Wait, did he want to be a part of their pack? No, he thought, pushing the idea away. It was better to be on his own. But then why did he want to rush over to them? Get a grip, Jackson thought. Those kids didn't want to see him. They hated him, right? Jackson slipped behind a parked car and squatted down behind it. He'd wait until they were out of sight and then hurry home, just like he'd planned. As Jackson watched the kids walk by, those wolves popped back into his mind. He remembered their ferocious growls and snarls when the grizzly appeared. He could practically hear them. Grrr. The sound got louder. Grrr. But wait, that sound wasn't in his mind. It was all around him. What was happening? Jackson's body started to tremble. But no, it wasn't just his body shaking. Everything was shaking. Suddenly, a woman screamed, "Earthquake!" Chapter 12. All at once, everyone who had been heading toward the docks rushed back toward the street. People screamed. Parents scooped up their children. Cars slammed on their brakes. Jackson started to stand up to join the rush. His heart was beating a mile a minute, but then he squatted back down. Earthquakes happen all the time, he reminded himself. There were more earthquakes here in Alaska than anywhere in the lower 48 states, even California. In the bush, the ground would suddenly start shaking. Trees would sway. Rabbits would dart out of their underground tunnels. Once, some jars of moose meat fell from their kitchen shelves and shattered on the floor. But that was the worst earthquake damage Jackson had seen. He braced himself against the parked car, expecting the earthquake to stop any moment. It didn't. The roaring got louder. The shaking got harder. Louder. Harder. Louder. Harder. The water in the harbor began to churn and froth, like an evil witch's brew. Waves sloshed across the bridge. Fishing boats in the harbor bounced around like toys. The Chinna strained against its thick ropes. Louder. Harder. Louder. Harder. The bridge was shaking so violently now that Jackson was bouncing up and down like a ball. His backpack slammed into his head over and over again. He braced himself against the car and glanced around for the other kids. Where had they gone? Hopefully off the bridge and back onto the street, which was where Jackson had to go. He managed to stumble to the street, but then he fell again, and this time it was impossible to stand back up. The earth seemed to be alive, rising and falling, twisting and rolling. Jackson felt like he was trying to crawl across the back of a furious, thrashing monster. Louder, harder, louder, harder. Crash! The wooden building on the corner collapsed into a heap. Boom! A telephone pole fell to the ground, dragging down wires that sparked and hissed like flaming snakes. Screams rose above the roar, and then came a sound so loud, Jackson was sure his ears would explode. Whoosh! People had stopped running and crawling, and were staring back toward the loading dock. The Chinna seemed to be sinking, and the buildings and docks were crumbling apart and sliding into the harbor. Jackson couldn't understand what he was looking at. Somehow the land was caving in, pouring into the harbor. But how was that possible? Jackson sat there on the ground, blinking hard. None of this could be real. But every time he opened his eyes, more of the waterfront was gone. The warehouse, the cannery, the cars and trucks. And it wasn't just the waterfront right in front of him. Looking up and down the coast, all the land along the water seemed to be melting away. Louder, harder, louder, harder. Jackson slammed his eyes shut. He couldn't watch. He had to get away. And now, through his swirl of panic, all he could think of was Mom and Dad and Uncle Solly. He started crawling across the street. He'd made it halfway across when, crack! A massive gash opened in the ground right in front of him. A fissure. Jackson had read about these giant splits in the earth. Never in his life did he think he would see one. He peered down into the blackness. How deep was it? And what was down there? He didn't want to know. He just wanted to get away. He quickly spun around. Crack! But another gash yawned open. Crack! Jackson sat there, frozen in fear. A sickening stench huffed at him from the earth's open jaws. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying not to imagine what was down there. But his mind flashed with nightmare pictures. Bubbling, burning lava. Shooting flames. The wide open jaws of a flesh-eating beast. He felt the ground beneath him start to give way. No, no, no! But down Jackson went, screaming into the darkness. Chapter 13. Oomph! Jackson landed on his side on soft, wet sand. The stench made him gag, but his backpack had broken his fall. There was no boiling lava, no flames. He was not inside the mouth of a slobbering beast. He was at the bottom of a narrow pit. It was very dark, and everything was still shaking. But peering up, Jackson could see the street. He guessed he'd only fallen about 6 feet. Might as well be 100 feet, Jackson thought, because there was no way to get out. He stretched out his arms, feeling the jagged sides. If a fissure could open up, could it also slam shut? Could he be crushed? He had to get out of here. But how? He started to take off his backpack. Maybe he could signal with his flashlight or use his rope to somehow pull himself up. Except before he could get it off, freezing water started to seep up from the ground, soaking his boots. And then, whoosh! Jackson screamed as a blast of freezing water exploded underneath him, a spray so powerful it rocketed him up out of the pit. It was like being shot through the blowhole of a huge whale. The water knocked the air from his lungs. It gushed into his mouth and up his nose. And then, with a sickening crunch of his ankle, his body landed on the hard, wet street. Pain exploded from the tips of his toes to the top of his leg. He lay there, too dazed to think. It took him a long moment to realize that the roaring had stopped. The ground was still. Finally, the earthquake was over. Gritting his teeth against the pain in his leg, Jackson managed to sit himself up. He was on the side of the street. Hunks of icy snow mixed with giant rocks had been coughed up from under the ground. Towers of water blasted up from some of the cracks. The water was brown and smelled rotten, like an outhouse on a hot day. Jackson tried not to think of what was in the water that he'd swallowed. A man rushed by him, carrying a crying little boy in his arms. A woman limped past. He didn't see Leonore or Chris or Nora or Mary. Had they made it off the bridge in time? Were they safe? Jackson turned and stared in horror at the harbor, blinking in disbelief. Everything that had been there minutes ago was gone. All the docks and buildings, all the people who hadn't made it over the bridge in time. The China had broken free of its ropes and was drifting in the harbor. Except it wasn't a harbor anymore. It was a swirling sea of wreckage. Everything that had been on the docks was now part of a wild whirlpool. Everything and everyone. Panic tore at Jackson's insides. Where were Mom and Dad and Uncle Sully? He had to find them, now. They were at the house they were building, but where was that? Jackson didn't know, and even if he did, he couldn't get there. His ankle was broken, he was sure. The pain was sickening. He could feel it swelling up inside his boot. There was no way he could walk or even stand. A hopeless feeling came over Jackson. His mind started to whirl. Big, hot tears hung in the corners of Jackson's eyes. He tried to brush them away. "Be tough," he scolded himself. "Get to work." But his panic only grew. "Get to work." He said the words over and over to himself. But they just spun around in his mind like the wreckage churning in the harbor. Because what could he do? Mom and Dad had never prepared him for anything like this. He dragged himself out of the icy puddle where he'd landed. Sucking in his breath and fighting tears, he crawled slowly off the street and into a building that was somehow still standing. He sat there, shivering, his soaked, wet backpack next to him. A strange sound came out of his mouth. Not a scream, not a sob. It was a weak, rasping cry. It reminded him of a sound he'd heard before. On the night of the cabin fire, the winter bear had made that sound. The winter bear. Now Jackson understood how that bear had felt when it let loose that horrible cry. Lost. Terrified. Totally alone. Chapter 14. And then Jackson heard voices. Familiar voices calling his name. "Jackson? Leonore? Jackson, where are you?" "Chris?" "No. Jackson must be hearing things. But the voices got louder, closer. Jackson? Mary? Nora? Jackson slid out from the doorway. His heart rose up at the sight of the 4 kids. They were just down the street, peering into buildings, looking for something. Looking for Jackson? I'm right here, he shouted. In a flash, they were all around him, crouching down, hovering close. Jackson stared at their faces, which were streaked with dirt and tears. He knew he must look the same. We were looking for you, Leonore said in a ragged voice. Her hair was matted with dirt. We saw you fall into that crack, said Chris. Blood oozed from a deep cut on his cheek. We were so scared, Nora said. We were praying you got out, and you did, said Mary. Jackson just stared at them, amazed. But his relief quickly faded when he saw the look of fear on Leonore's face. We have to get out of here, she said breathlessly. People are saying there's going to be a tsunami. Tsunamis. Massive waves that often happened after earthquakes. Jackson looked around at the shattered ground and the collapsed buildings. This was nothing compared to what a powerful tsunami could do. A tsunami could swallow up everything and everyone that was left in Valdez. Come on, Leonore said, holding out her hand. But Jackson shook his head. I can't walk, he said. My ankle's broken. He swallowed hard. You should go. Each person needed to take care of themselves, right? Chris turned around so that his back was to Jackson. He was ready to run away from here. Of course he is, Jackson thought. But he didn't take off. He lowered himself down right in front of Jackson. You can ride on my back, he said. The next thing Jackson knew, Leonore and Mary had taken hold of his arms. They gently pulled him up. Nora held his back so he wouldn't fall. Keeping his weight off his crushed ankle, Jackson managed to stand long enough to get himself up onto Chris's back. Hold on tight, Leonore said, looping her arm around Jackson's to help hold him. As they headed away from the harbor, Jackson turned and saw his backpack lying on the ground. Wait, he started to say, but he stopped himself. There wasn't time to go back. And besides, what he needed right now wasn't in that backpack. He tightened his grip on Chris. He looked at Leonore. He felt Mary's and Nora's hands on his back, and together they ran for their lives. Chapter 15. About 4 months later, Monday, August 10th, 1964, 120 miles north of Valdez, near the Copper River. Jackson gripped his fishing pole, gave it a jiggle. Drops of sweat trickled down his back. It was a very hot day, 50 degrees. He shouldn't have worn his flannel shirt, but it was still a perfect summer day in the bush. Birds chattered from the trees. An eagle soared overhead. Jackson breathed in the familiar summer smells. Pine, wildflowers, river water. He looked proudly at the bucket of fish he'd caught for dinner, and then he spotted something moving just across the river. A very large animal. A grizzly! Jackson's whole body tensed, but then he relaxed. It was summer, he reminded himself. That bear had plenty of food. The river was wide and deep here, the water rushing fast. Grizzlies were good swimmers, but there was no reason for that bear to make a dangerous journey to cross. Still, Jackson backed away slowly. He kept his eyes on the bear as he crouched down behind a bush. He sucked in his breath as a flash of pain shot through his ankle. It had mostly healed, thanks to 2 surgeries in the hospital in Anchorage, but it still ached sometimes. Jackson watched the bear through the bushes. It was small but looked healthy. Its light brown fur was thick and glossy. Jackson's mouth dropped open when he noticed that part of the grizzly's ear was missing. A chill ran up his spine. Could it be? The bear turned, and Jackson saw a patch of bare flesh on his back. The skin looked scarred, like it had been burned. His eyes widened and his heart sped up. "It's you," Jackson thought. "The winter bear." Jackson watched in awe as the bear drank from the river. It lifted its big head and looked around. It was enjoying this bright day just like Jackson was. And then it turned and trotted off into the woods. Jackson barely noticed the tears rolling down his cheeks. That bear had been through so much, but here it was, strong and healthy, just like Jackson. He'd made it through the most powerful earthquake in United States history. The quake had wrecked parts of downtown Anchorage and towns and villages across Alaska. Monster tsunamis smashed into Kodiak, Seward, and Whittier. The worst was in the small village of Chenega. A wall of water more than 70 feet high practically wiped the village off the earth. Luckily, the waves that hit Valdez after the quake were just a few feet high. They flooded the downtown, but then the worst was over. And Jackson and the other kids were safe in Miss Lawrence's car. She'd spotted them as they hurried up Alaska Avenue. She'd driven them out of town, zigzagging around fissures and fallen telephone poles, stopping to pick up other dazed and bloodied people. They wound up at a campsite about 6 miles from town. Dozens of other people from Valdez had fled to that spot too. People were terrified that other waves would strike, or aftershocks, strong jolts that could destroy the buildings already weakened by the first quake. Jackson's chest got tight as he thought about that long night. He walked back to the river and splashed his face with the cold river water. But more memories came flooding back, the ear-splitting roar of the quake that rang in his ears for days. The desperate voices of people calling out for their children, their parents, their friends. The angry glow of the fires that erupted in Valdez when giant oil tanks exploded. Worst of all was the terror of thinking he might never see Mom or Dad or Uncle Sully again. One by one, the kids' families had all appeared at the campsite. But by 10 o'clock that night, Jackson was still waiting on Miss Lawrence's car. She never left his side, never let go of his hand. And then finally, there they were, 3 faces peering through the window of Miss Lawrence's car. Next thing Jackson knew, he was in Mom's arms, with Dad and Uncle Sully huddled close. They explained how Uncle Sully's car had been crushed by a tree. They'd walked for hours looking for Jackson. "We would have walked forever to find you," Mom had said. Jackson stepped back from the river and wiped his face with the bottom of his shirt. He took a deep breath and wiped away another round of tears. No use trying to hold them back. Lately, Jackson had realized that even tough people cried sometimes. Even tough people had nightmares and wanted their moms to stay with them until they fell back asleep. Even tough people froze in panic when a rumble of thunder reminded them of an earthquake. Even tough people needed a friend to carry them when they were too hurt to walk on their own. Jackson stood there until the swirl of memories faded away. Then he started to pack up his fishing gear. It was getting late. Mom and Dad would be expecting him. Wait until they heard about the winter bear. They didn't blame the bear for what happened to the cabin. Neither did Jackson. Not anymore. He understood that the creature had just been looking for food. Mom and Dad would be happy to know the bear was healthy and strong. It meant the bear wouldn't go looking for food at people's cabins again. Not that Jackson or Mom or Dad would ever have to worry about a cabin because they weren't rebuilding theirs. They were leaving the bush for good. They decided together that they belonged in Valdez with Uncle Sully, with their friends. This trip to the bush was just a visit. They'd come for only 2 weeks. Tomorrow they were heading back to Valdez. The waterfront was gone, parts of the town were still badly damaged, and a lot of people had left for good, like Nora, who was living in Juneau now. She wrote letters to Jackson every week, and Mary, who had moved with her family to Seattle. Jackson missed both of them, but Leonore's and Chris's family had stayed. Miss Lawrence, too. Uncle Sully, of course, and plenty of others. They were all working together to rebuild the town, but not in the same place. In the weeks after the earthquake, scientists came to Valdez. They discovered why all that land along the coast had crumbled away. It turned out it wasn't really land. It was a mix of sand and water. When the shaking started, it melted away into the sea. The town's new spot was 4 miles up the coast where the ground was solid rock. Valdez will rise up again, Uncle Sully had said with his usual pride, and it will be even better than before. Jackson picked up his rod and his bucket of fish. He gazed out over the river into the forest. He thought of all the lessons he'd learned growing up here. Most of all, he'd learned how to take care of himself. But the earthquake had taught Jackson another lesson, that he needed other people too. He didn't want to be like the grizzly, a fierce creature living alone. He wanted to be like a wolf, part of a pack. Jackson took one last look around and started back toward the campsite. He loved this wild and beautiful land, and he'd miss living here, but he'd be back to visit, he knew. And next time, maybe he'd bring his friends.